Ms. Shyamala Bembey completed her master's in biochemistry, and then she went on to do her diploma in radiation medical technology. And she is now the radiation safety officer and the scientific officer at Gangaram Hospital in the nuclear medicine department. Welcome, Shyamala, and nice to have you aboard. Over to you now.
Thank you, Dr. Seema. Thank you, Kaho, for giving us this platform to discuss a very sensitive area of radiation safety, and especially Dr. Seema, who is the chairman of the diagnostic division, to even thinking of holding a CME on radiation safety, because with the increasing applications of radioactivity in all aspects of today's life, this is becoming a much needed area that needs to be looked into. Basically, the topic is the need for radiation safety in the first place. What is radiation? Basically, radiation is energy in the form of waves and particles, and it has been there with us since the beginning of time. So it's nothing new. It's been living with it. But as time is progressing, we are using more and more of it in our day-to-day lives, and which is increasing the hazard of radiation exposure to all of us. So how do we go about reducing the risk and protecting ourselves is going to be the main crux of the topic for today's CME. We know that radioactivity is basically being formed because an unstable nucleus or any element which has excess energy is passing on this energy to become more stable. We have been living with naturally occurring radioactive sources in the earth. We have the radon gas, which is being emitted from the uranium and thorium, which is there in the Earth's crust. We have potassium-40, which is found in minerals and in plants. And then we have carbon-14, which is found again in animals and plants, and which is used extensively for fossil dating. And the archaeologists are really dependent on this for dating the excavation sites. And then we have opted to live for the man-made radiations also, such as we have television and mobile phones, the smoke detectors, airline travel, and as we go higher elevations, the more the exposure. And then we have the medical use of radioactive isotope. So way back in 1980s, if we looked at the exposure levels that were there to the general human population, more of it was coming from the radon and the naturally occurring sources. But as we progressed in times, you can appreciate that the background has started reducing, and the medical and the occupational exposures have started, in fact, they have practically doubled. So if you can appreciate this pie diagram versus the previous one, you realize that the red part, which was the naturally occurring exposure, has reduced drastically, and the CT and the other nuclear medicine exposures has gone up to a much higher percentage. This symbol is very familiar to us. We know what this means. But if you show this to any lay person or maybe just a child, it will not make any sense to him. We know that this indicates that we are using radiation in some part of that area and we need to be careful. So why? After that sign, when they realized, the regulatory bodies realized that this sign really meant nothing to the general public, they devised a new signage, especially for the sealed sources, where this radiation sign was shown emitting radiation, and then included the diagram of the skull on it, along with a man running. So this was a very self-explanatory signage, showing that in case the sign is there, it means harm and you need to stay away. This was very necessary, especially for times when there was no real regulation of the disposal of radioactive sources, sealed sources. And this led to many unfortunate episodes where these scrap dealers dealt with these, and it caused death of many of these scrap dealers because they're just not aware they were handling radiation sources. Now with the regulatory board of ARB coming in with the online licensing, it has become mandatory that all the X-ray departments need to register themselves online, which we'll be talking about later. And every X-ray department now needs to have this signage along with the copy of the ARB license that should be displayed outside the department. We all know that different types of radiation in nature we learned it from our school time setting, the alpha, beta, gamma, and the positrons and electron capture. Each of these have a very typical characteristics due to which their effect on any substance that they attack or fall on is going to be different. We have alpha, which has a much higher mass and a positive charge, beta, which is negatively charged electron, and gamma, which is primarily just energy waves. So if you appreciate that once this energy hits a human surface or any absorbing surface, within if you can appreciate within the power of 10 to the minus 16 seconds, this exposure is going to cause ionization and excitation. It's not even fraction, it's a fraction of a second. Then within 10 to the power of minus 5 seconds, there's going to be direct action, radical formation because of indirect action, which will result in a molecular change. Then within a second or a minute, you have the biological damage taking place. 1 minute to 1 hour, you have the DNA damage. And then within an hour or day, cell damage. 1 day to 1 year, organ damage, late effects, and maybe ultimately death. So immediate effects we would look at would be especially on fast-growing cells, so the younger population is more at risk. We have fatigue and nausea, we have hair loss, we have diarrhea, then we have even DNA damage taking place, which may affect the reproductive cells also, and maybe become more evident in the next generation, and then maybe long-time effects of cancer and tissue damage. Exposure of around 16 millisievert, that is the unit that we're using to measure radiation exposure. But exposure of maybe 5,000 millisievert or a 10,000 millisievert at one time may prove to be fatal to us. The effects of biological exposure will depend on the type of the radiation involved, the size of dose received, the rate of dose received at over a time period, part of the body exposed, age of the individual, and the biological difference. The effects are primarily classified as stochastic and non-stochastic. What we mean by non-stochastic is that there is a certain threshold over which these effects are going to be evident. So more the dose incident, more the severity. Example would be a cataract or a burn, radiation burn. Stochastic effects are when there is no threshold. The minute the radiation exposure starts, this effects will start taking place in the body. It is not at all dose dependent, and these would be something like cancer or maybe some genetic damage taking place at the DNA level. So that's why there is a need for radiation protection, especially for radiation workers who are having occupational exposure, and for patients who are undergoing radiological procedures. We know it is not possible to eliminate these risks totally, but we need to develop some safety standards so that these risks are minimized. That is the objective of radiation protection, to prevent the source of radiation causing any deterministic effects and to reduce the likelihood of stochastic effects. So three basic principles, as Dr. Patkar has already mentioned, is justification, dose limitation, and optimization of those. By justification is, as he said, we have every practice, every procedure that is going to cause any radiation exposure has to be justified and has to be for the benefit of the patient. We need to optimize the practice so that we do not compromise on the quality and the reporting, but at the same time, do not cause unnecessary use of radioactivity. And we try to limit the dose as much as possible to prevent any likelihood of stochastic effects. The ALARA principle, as Dr. Patkar already mentioned, as low as reasonably achievable, or as we say, as low as reasonably possible, without compromising on the quality. The effective dose exposures have been specified now for occupational exposures and for general public. It's 20 millisievert per year over a defined period of 5 years, and 1 millisievert in a year for the public. The lens of the eye is at 150 millisievert only, and then the skin is and the extremities are 500 millisievert per year for occupational workers, and for the public it is much less. The only change in the levels over ICRP 60 and ICRP 103 is that the lens of the eye exposure rate has come down to 20 millisieverts. There's a way of calculating how much, at what level this dose exposure is to be monitored, and this is specified for each part of the body. So how do we go about it? The mantra is the TDS principle that we follow: time, distance, and shielding to reduce the radiation exposure. You try to limit the time as much as possible, increase the distance, more the distance, less exposure, and use shielding. Now, as I said, each of these radiations, radioactivity has different properties. Alpha, being a higher molecule with more charge, is easily stopped by even a piece of paper. Then you have beta rays, which are high electrons, negatively charged, which can traverse through paper but can be stopped with a thin aluminum foil. Then you have gamma rays and X-rays, which are basically electromagnetic radiations, which can pass through these three but can be stopped by a thick lead shield. And then you have the neutron rays, which can be stopped with water or concrete, and we can use these for shielding. So shielding by lead can be with the use of lead shields or lead glass. And we have personal protective equipment like lead glasses, the thyroid shield, lead gloves, and the lead apron, which is being regularly used in all radiology departments. But in spite of all this, we know that there is exposure going to be taking place, and so we need to monitor it. Now we know it exists, but we know we cannot hear it, we cannot feel it, we cannot see it. So we have to have an indirect way of measuring the radiation on either a medium such as air or film. And this, the occupational dose limits, which have been set for occupational workers, is to limit the exposure and to see how much exposure the person has got over a period of time throughout his tenure as a radiation worker. We have monitoring devices to monitor this radiation exposure. We have area monitoring devices, which are either contamination survey monitors, which look like this. These are used to monitor the atmospheric radiation levels, and in specific areas like hot areas where there's more of radioactive activity exposure chances, and cold areas such as reception where there's not supposed to be any radiation at all. Also in nuclear medicine, when we are handling loose radioactive sources, there are chances of contamination and spillage, which can be monitored by these monitors. And then we have the personal monitoring devices, which are used by the individual. The purpose of this is to obtain the mean equivalent dose or the effective dose of a radiation worker over his tenure for the period that he's working as a radiation worker. And anyone who's going to be expected to be getting more than 10% of the applicable dose limit will require a personal monitor. We have different types of personal monitors. We have ring dosimeters, we have the pocket dosimeter, and we have the TLD. TLD, so-called because of its a thermoluminescent detector. What happens is it has a film which has a substance which absorbs the energy, the radiation, stores it, and then when it is heated, it releases that energy in the form of luminescence. So indirectly, depending on how much of that energy, a light photon is there, we imply that the person has been exposed to that much radiation. So this is how a radiation TLD case looks like, and that's a film that comes with it. This film is specific for each individual. It has the name of the institute, number of the institute, the name of the individual, and the time period also is specified. It's generally for 1 quarter, and after every quarter, this film batch is supposed to go back to Ultratech laboratories, and they will monitor all the readings and give it back to you. So this is a case. It's got a metallic filter for alpha, and it's got a plastic for beta, and it's got an open window for gamma radiation. This has the name, number, and period, as I said, and these are 3 discs which are used for monitoring, which will be read in the laboratory, which you send it back to. We get a revert from them in the form of TLD readings for every quarter, where the name of the TLD holder is specified and the time period and how much dose he has been exposed to. All this is supposed to be monitored by the radiation safety officer of your center or department. And in case there is any overexposure, you need to investigate that matter. And it's a genuine exposure, then you have to report the episode, that exposure, to ARB, and they will look into why this exposure is taking place, and if there is any physical or biological change in that individual, and it needs to be subjected to further investigations. So we also have a radiation safety committee, as Dr. Partner mentioned. We are supposed to have a radiation safety committee, which keeps a track of all these readings and all the regulatory necessities of each department. So as Madam Marie Curie has very rightly said that nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so we may fear less. Our safety is in our hands. Thank you so much.